This is Strides to Solutions. I am your host, Esther Adams. There is a specific kind of confusion that often follows the end of a relationship, one that has less to do with sadness itself and more to do with the gap between what a person knows intellectually and what their body and mind seem to be doing anyway. Someone can understand completely that a relationship is over. They can agree it was the right decision or accept that it was not going to work regardless of what anyone wanted. And yet, weeks or months later, they find themselves checking a former partner's social media at 2 in the morning, replaying arguments in their head that serve no purpose, or feeling a jolt of something close to panic at an unexpected reminder, long after the relationship's actual importance in their daily life would seem to justify. The usual explanation for this is simply that heartbreak takes time, that grief has its own schedule and cannot be rushed. That is true as far as it goes, but it does not really explain the specific shape this experience tends to take, why certain behaviors seem to keep the wound open rather than closing it, or why some people move through this process in months while others remain stuck in it for years. The research on attachment, memory, and prediction reveals something more precise underneath the general idea that heartbreak takes time, and understanding it changes how strange and disproportionate some of these reactions actually are. The place to start is with what a long term romantic partner actually becomes at the level of the brain's internal machinery, because the answer is more literal than people usually assume. Attachment theory, developed originally to describe the bond between infants and caregivers, treats a primary attachment figure as something the nervous system relies on directly for a sense of safety and stability, not merely as a source of enjoyment or company. Once an adult romantic partner occupies this role, that partner effectively becomes encoded into the brain's ongoing predictions about daily life, treated less like an external, optional feature of one's world and more like a stable, expected fixture that the mind assumes will continue to be present. This matters enormously for understanding what happens when that person is suddenly gone, because it means the brain is not simply losing a source of pleasant company. It is losing something its predictive models had been quietly counting on, continuously, the way those same models count on gravity working or the sun rising. This distinction between losing a preference and losing a predicted feature of reality helps explain some of the more physically intense reactions people report after a breakup, reactions that can otherwise seem wildly out of proportion to what, on paper, was simply the ending of a relationship. Brain imaging research comparing people going through a recent breakup to control groups has found that images and reminders related to relationship dissolution activate the hippocampus and the amygdala, two structures central to memory and threat processing, at levels that are comparable to how the brain responds to events that would meet clinical criteria for psychological trauma. This is a striking finding because it means the brain, at least in certain respects, is not treating a breakup as an unfortunate but ordinary life event. It is treating it, physiologically, more like a genuine threat, which helps explain why the emotional aftermath can feel so disproportionate to what an outside observer, or even the person's own more rational thinking, would expect. There is a deeper layer to this story that comes from research on the actual neurochemistry of pair bonding, much of it developed first in animal models and then connected back to human experience. Bonding between partners across several species studied closely by researchers recruits a combination of oxytocin and dopamine, signaling that links the specific individual cues associated with a partner, their presence, their voice, their particular patterns of behavior, to the brain's core reward system. This is part of what makes a specific partner feel irreplaceable rather than simply interchangeable with anyone else who might provide similar company. But this same wiring becomes a liability the moment the bond is severed because the brain's reward system does not immediately unlearn the association. In prairie voles, a species researchers rely on heavily for studying monogamous pair bonding. Separating a bonded pair produces measurable depressive and anxiety like behavior, along with elevated stress hormones and heightened pain sensitivity, And this occurs alongside specific changes at the molecular level, including a reduction in oxytocin receptors and a shift in dopamine related gene activity within a brain region central to reward processing. The proposed mechanism behind this is genuinely illuminating. When an animal or a person continues seeking proximity to a bonded partner who is no longer available, the brain generates something researchers describe using the language of reward prediction error, the same basic signal that underlies disappointment when an expected reward fails to arrive. Yearning in this framework is not simply an emotional state layered on top of memory. It is closer to a repeated, ongoing signal generated every time the brain reaches for an expected reward, the partner's presence, and comes up empty. Researchers studying human grief and loss more broadly have proposed a model that captures the same underlying logic in slightly more general terms, describing bonding as encoding an implicit prediction that the bonded person will always be present, which is precisely why the stress of losing them tends to feel primary and automatic rather than something that requires conscious thought to generate. Under this framework, grieving itself is best understood as a form of learning, specifically the slow, effortful process of updating an internal model that has to absorb new information it was never designed to expect, namely the permanent absence of someone the model had encoded as a fixed, ongoing feature of reality. This learning process requires actual neural updating over time, built gradually through repeated experience of the world, continuing to function without the person in it, which is part of why intellectually accepting that a relationship has ended does very little on its own to complete this deeper, slower kind of updating. This same disruption extends beyond the attachment and reward systems into something closer to a person's basic sense of identity. Research on self concept clarity, meaning how clearly and consistently a person understands who they are, has found that this clarity reliably drops following a breakup, and the drop itself predicts emotional distress and depressive symptoms independent of how the person otherwise feels about the relationship ending. For people high in what researchers call attachment anxiety, characterized by a strong underlying fear of abandonment and a tendency toward hypervigilance about a partner's availability, this loss of self concept clarity appears to be a particularly important driver of a specific and somewhat counterproductive urge, the desire to reunite with an ex partner, not necessarily because the relationship itself was working well, but because reunion offers a shortcut back to a more stable, more coherent sense of self. This helps explain why some people find themselves wanting to get back together with a partner they can describe quite clearly and honestly as having been wrong for them, since the pull is not always really about the relationship. It is sometimes about restoring a sense of identity coherence that the breakup disrupted, even when restoring the relationship itself would likely recreate the very problems that made it end in the first place. A related disruption occurs in what researchers call future simulation, meaning the brain's ongoing capacity to imagine and predict what is coming next in a person's life. Under normal circumstances, this capacity draws heavily on a set of interconnected brain regions collectively known as the default mode network, which supports exactly this kind of forward looking, self referential thinking. Because a long term partner tends to be woven extensively into a person's imagined future, plans, routines, shared expectations, that entire predictive apparatus takes a real hit when the relationship ends, and there is direct evidence connecting this disruption to how people cope afterward. Individuals showing more severe depressive symptoms following a breakup tend to show a pattern of brain activity marked by heavier, more persistent engagement of the default mode network specifically, alongside reduced engagement of networks associated with attention directed outward toward the external world. This pattern fits closely with what depressive rumination looks like from the outside. Someone stuck cycling through internally generated thoughts about the past and an uncertain future, with reduced capacity to engage with whatever is actually happening around them in the present moment. There is a further layer of individual variation worth adding to this picture, involving what researchers call rejection sensitivity, meaning a person's general tendency to anxiously expect, readily perceive, and strongly react to rejection across relationships more broadly, not only in the specific context of a breakup. This trait appears to split into two distinguishable emotional flavors that predict genuinely different behavioral outcomes. When rejection sensitivity manifests mainly as anxious expectation of being rejected, it tends to predict withdrawal, operating through a pathway involving self blame and rumination, essentially turning the anticipated rejection into evidence against oneself and retreating accordingly. When the same underlying sensitivity manifests instead as anger in response to perceived or anticipated rejection, it tends to predict a very different outcome: aggression, operating through a pathway involving catastrophizing and blaming the other person rather than oneself. This distinction helps explain why two people who might describe themselves similarly as someone who takes rejection hard can end up behaving in almost opposite ways after a breakup, one retreating into self blame and isolation, the other escalating toward anger, confrontation, or even the kind of persistent monitoring and contact that can shade into genuinely intrusive behavior. Some individuals do not settle cleanly into either the pursuit or the withdrawal pattern, but instead oscillate between them, a pattern that researchers link most strongly to what is sometimes called fearful attachment, a profile combining both high anxiety and high avoidance simultaneously. People with this combined profile appear to lack a single, organized strategy for managing the distress a breakup generates, and the research describes this as showing the highest level of emotional dysregulation among the various insecure attachment patterns studied. The practical result can look like genuine inconsistency from the outside, and sometimes from the inside as well, periods of active pursuit, reaching out, checking, ruminating, alternating with periods of avoidance and suppression, as though the person's own nervous system cannot settle on which strategy to commit to. This oscillation appears to reflect a genuine underlying conflict between two systems pulling in opposite directions at once: hyperactivation pushing toward proximity and reassurance seeking, deactivation pushing toward distance and emotional shutdown, rather than a simple lack of discipline or a personality quirk unrelated to the deeper attachment mechanisms already described. Given everything covered so far, attachment disruption, reward prediction error, identity destabilization, and disrupted future simulation, it becomes possible to understand why certain post breakup behaviors seem to help in the moment, while actually working against the deeper process of updating that eventually needs to happen. This is where individual differences in attachment style become genuinely useful for understanding why the same event, a breakup, produces such different behavioral responses in different people. Broadly, the research identifies what looks like two competing families of strategy, sometimes described as hyperactivation and deactivation, along with a further pattern involving self directed distress that cuts across both. People higher in attachment anxiety tend toward hyperactivating strategies, meaning behavior that keeps active, ongoing focus on the lost partner rather than allowing that focus to fade. This shows up as persistent rumination about the relationship and the person, a documented tendency toward automatic approach responses when reminded of the ex partner, meaning something closer to an unconscious pull toward them, even in simple reaction time tasks, and a heightened vulnerability to the kind of digital monitoring behavior that has become extremely common given how much of daily life now happens online. Research specifically examining social media surveillance after a breakup has found that emotional distress itself, more than attachment style considered on its own, tends to be the most consistent factor associated with this kind of monitoring, with attachment anxiety contributing indirectly by amplifying that underlying distress rather than by driving the checking behavior in some more direct mechanical way. In other words, it is not exactly that anxious attachment makes someone check a phone. It is that anxious attachment tends to generate more breakup related distress, and that distress is what drives the checking, a subtle but meaningful distinction because it suggests the checking behavior is fundamentally an attempt at emotional relief rather than simply a habit tied to a particular personality trait. People higher in attachment avoidance tend toward the opposite family of strategies, generally described as deactivating, involving emotional suppression, distancing, and a kind of active disengagement from processing the loss at all. In the short term, this pattern tends to look from the outside and even from the person's own subjective report considerably calmer and less distressed than the anxious hyperactivating pattern. But the research on this is fairly consistent in finding that this apparent calm can be somewhat misleading. Suppression appears to reduce the outward expression of distress without actually reducing the underlying emotional experience itself, which means the distress does not disappear so much as it goes unprocessed. And several studies tracking outcomes over longer periods have found that this pattern is associated with greater overall distress accumulating over time, even though it looks more manageable in the early weeks. This creates a somewhat counterintuitive picture where the person who appears to be coping best in the first month may, in some cases, be building toward a worse outcome further down the line than the person who appears to be struggling visibly and immediately. A third pattern, distinct from both pursuit and withdrawal, involves what researchers describe as self attack, meaning the distress generated by a breakup gets turned inward toward self punishment, self criticism, and a diminished sense of self worth. This pattern shows up particularly strongly among people whose sense of self worth was closely tied to the relationship itself, since for these individuals, the breakup can function almost as confirmation of an underlying, pre existing fear that they are somehow fundamentally unworthy of love or connection. Attachment insecurity, more broadly, whether anxious or avoidant in its specific flavor, predicts higher rates of this self punishment coping style, and research following people over time has found that this particular coping style is a stronger predictor of later depressive and anxiety symptoms than either avoidance coping or pursuit oriented behavior considered on their own. There is also research suggesting that people who initiated the breakup themselves are not exempt from this pattern, and that self compassion, meaning the capacity to treat oneself with the same kindness one might offer a friend going through something difficult, appears to genuinely buffer against this self attack pathway, reducing the link between breakup distress and later depressive symptoms, specifically among people who ended the relationship. It is worth returning to the specific behaviors that keep a person tethered to the relationship even after it has officially ended, because the research here is genuinely useful for understanding which common post breakup habits tend to slow down the deeper process of psychological updating, as opposed to which ones tend to support it. Continued digital surveillance of an ex partner is one of the more consistently studied examples, and researchers have found that this kind of ongoing online exposure is associated with more distress, a stronger persisting desire for the ex partner, and less measurable personal growth in the months that follow. Part of what appears to be happening is fairly intuitive once you consider the attachment and prediction error framework already described. Continued exposure to the ex partner's life, their posts, their apparent moods, their new activities, keeps repeatedly reactivating exactly the reward seeking, attachment related circuitry that the whole updating process depends on, eventually settling down. Every glance at an update is, in a sense, another small reach toward an expected reward that the brain has not yet fully learned to stop expecting. A closely related pattern shows up in research on what has come to be called virtual possession management, referring to the accumulated digital traces of a relationship, photos, messages, shared playlists that people either keep or delete after a breakup. Researchers have found that retaining these virtual possessions tends to relate negatively to post breakup adjustment. And one proposed reason for this is genuinely interesting from a memory science perspective. Ordinarily, memory softens negative emotional content over time faster than positive content, a well documented pattern that helps painful memories lose some of their sting as time passes. But continued, repeated access to precisely preserved digital archives, exact photos, exact messages in their original unaltered form can work against that natural softening process, essentially forcing the brain to keep re encountering the relationship with a kind of archival accuracy that ordinary, fading memory would not otherwise provide. Nostalgia, in this context, can specifically motivate people to hold on to these virtual possessions, and holding on to them, in turn, appears to interfere with the gradual emotional fading that would otherwise support moving forward. Given all of this, it becomes worth asking, what does appear to genuinely support the underlying process of psychological updating after a breakup? Since the research does identify some fairly consistent answers here as well, alongside real uncertainty about exact mechanisms. Longitudinal research tracking whether attachment bonds to an ex partner persist or fade over time has found that these bonds do generally weaken gradually, with much of the relinquishment occurring over a period of roughly 4 years, though this trajectory is meaningfully slowed by continued contact with the former partner. People who maintain some form of ongoing contact, whether through direct communication or through the kind of passive digital exposure already discussed, tend to show a more persistent, less fully resolved bond compared to those with less continued contact, which fits naturally with the reward prediction error framework introduced earlier. If the brain's attachment and reward systems require repeated experience of the world functioning without the partner in order to properly update, then continued contact essentially interrupts that learning process at regular intervals, restarting a piece of the update each time. Entering a new relationship appears to function as a genuine, if somewhat blunt, accelerant for this same process. Research comparing people who form a new partnership relatively soon after a breakup to those who remain single finds that the new relationship group tends to report fewer intrusive thoughts about the previous relationship and generally shows signs of relinquishing the old attachment bond more readily. One proposed explanation is fairly straightforward, that a new partner can begin to occupy some of the same predictive and attachment related functions the previous partner used to serve, giving the brain's attachment system a new active target rather than leaving it reaching, unsuccessfully, toward someone no longer available. Broader social connection appears to support the same underlying process, even without a specific new romantic partner involved, with research finding that people who report stronger satisfaction with friends and other social contacts after a breakup tend to show better emotional adjustment and greater relief overall, suggesting that the underlying attachment and social systems being disrupted by a breakup can, to some real degree, be supported and partially soothed through connection more broadly, not solely through a specific romantic replacement. There is also evidence that actively narrating and making sense of the relationship, rather than either endlessly ruminating on it or trying to suppress thinking about it altogether, offers a distinct third path that appears genuinely constructive. Research examining what happens when people deliberately engage in structured reflection on a relationship that ended, working through what happened and why in an organized narrative form, has found that this kind of reflection is associated with greater causal understanding of the relationship's ending and more future oriented thinking about relationships generally afterward. This fits with the broader idea, discussed extensively in research on memory and identity, that autobiographical reasoning, the active work of connecting a past chapter of life coherently to one's present understanding of oneself, tends to support better psychological outcomes than either avoiding the topic entirely or getting stuck replaying it without ever actually processing or integrating what happened. It is worth adding one further layer to the pursuit and self attack patterns already described, because breakup distress does not arrive on a level playing field for everyone, and prior life history appears to meaningfully shape how severely someone experiences it. Research examining the role of earlier childhood experience has found that a history of childhood maltreatment predicts significantly greater breakup grief severity in adulthood, and this relationship appears to operate specifically through two connected pathways: greater reliance on emotional suppression and a stronger tendency toward insecure, anxious attachment. These two factors were found to be closely interrelated and to reinforce each other over time, suggesting something like a compounding cycle, where an earlier history of maltreatment shapes both how anxiously someone attaches to a partner and how much they suppress rather than process the resulting emotions. And each of those tendencies then makes the other somewhat worse. This is a useful reminder that a breakup for any given person is never really happening in isolation. It is landing on top of whatever attachment patterns and emotional habits that person's earlier life already built into their nervous system, which helps explain why a breakup that looks, from the outside, roughly comparable in scale and circumstance can produce such different intensities of distress in different people. On a more hopeful note, there is evidence that this entire system remains genuinely responsive to intervention, not simply something a person has to wait out passively. Research on a technique called attachment security priming, which involves deliberately and briefly activating mental representations of feeling safe and securely connected, has found meaningful positive effects across emotional, cognitive, and behavioral measures. And interestingly, these effects tend to be larger specifically among people who otherwise score higher on attachment anxiety or avoidance, meaning the people who might be expected to benefit least from a brief psychological exercise like this actually appear to benefit the most. Structured psychotherapy focused specifically on breakup recovery has also been studied directly, with research describing its value as operating through several concrete mechanisms, normalizing what can otherwise feel like an embarrassingly intense reaction to an ordinary life event, encouraging a level of self awareness the person might not otherwise build on their own, actively working through the story of the relationship rather than avoiding or endlessly repeating it, and directly challenging the kind of harsh self critical thinking connected to the self attack pattern described earlier. None of this suggests that recovering from a significant breakup can simply be willed into happening faster through effort alone, but it does suggest that the underlying attachment and predictive systems driving this experience are not fixed or unreachable, and that specific, targeted approaches appear to genuinely support the deeper updating process this entire episode has been describing. It is worth spending a moment specifically on rumination, since it appears repeatedly across nearly every pattern already described: pursuit, self attack, and even the oscillating profile, and understanding why it is so consistently unhelpful adds real clarity to the broader picture. Rumination, in the sense researchers use the term, refers to repetitive, passive dwelling on distressing thoughts and feelings without any accompanying movement toward resolution or problem solving. Broader research on rumination, well beyond the specific context of breakups, finds that it reliably magnifies and prolongs negative mood, interferes with a person's capacity for genuine problem solving and constructive action, and appears to reduce sensitivity to changing circumstances, meaning a person stuck ruminating can end up mentally responding to an outdated version of a situation rather than updating their thinking as things genuinely change around them. This maps directly onto the prediction error framework discussed earlier in this episode. Rumination keeps the attachment related predictive machinery actively engaged with the lost relationship, replaying scenarios and searching for resolution that repetitive internal review cannot actually provide, which likely helps explain why it so reliably correlates with worse, more prolonged breakup distress across the research already covered. There is also a specific, less obvious avoidant behavior worth naming, sometimes studied under the term ghosting, referring to ending a relationship or ongoing contact by abruptly and completely withdrawing communication rather than through any direct conversation or explanation. Research on this practice has found it to be more commonly used by people higher in attachment avoidance, which fits naturally with the broader deactivating pattern already described, minimizing direct emotional engagement with a difficult interaction by simply removing oneself from it entirely. This behavior is worth including here because it illustrates something important about the deactivating strategies discussed throughout this episode. They do not only shape how someone processes a breakup after it happens. For avoidantly attached individuals, they can also shape how the breakup itself gets carried out in the first place, extending the same underlying pattern of minimizing direct emotional confrontation into the ending of the relationship itself, not merely into what follows afterward. It is worth being honest about the limitations running through this entire body of research, because several genuine gaps and uncertainties remain, and a fair account should not smooth over them. A significant portion of the most mechanistically detailed evidence, particularly regarding the neurochemistry of pair bonding and the specific role of dopamine and oxytocin in separation distress, comes from research on prairie voles and other animal models rather than directly from humans. And while the parallels to human attachment and grief are compelling, the translational gap between rodent pair bond separation and the far more complex, culturally embedded experience of a human romantic breakup has not been fully mapped. The human neuroimaging studies that do exist, including the research finding trauma comparable brain activation following breakups, tend to rely on quite small samples, which limits how confidently the findings can be generalized to the wider population. Much of the behavioral research on post breakup coping, including nearly everything concerning digital surveillance, virtual possessions, and rumination, relies on cross sectional designs, meaning people are surveyed at a single point in time, which makes it genuinely difficult to establish clear causal direction. It remains an open question, for instance, whether attachment anxiety and emotional distress reliably drive social media surveillance, or whether people who are already inclined toward this kind of monitoring behavior simply also tend to experience more breakup distress for reasons the current research design cannot fully untangle. There is also a genuinely surprising finding worth flagging directly that in at least one detailed study comparing people who did and did not escalate to more intensive monitoring and cyber aggressive behavior after a breakup, measures of emotion regulation ability and impulse control did not actually differ between these groups, which complicates any simple story suggesting that these behaviors are primarily driven by a straightforward deficit in self control. Cultural context adds a further layer of complexity, since several of the studies feeding into this body of research draw on specific national samples, and at least one cross cultural comparison found that the link between self concept clarity and breakup distress was measurably weaker in a more collectivist cultural context than in a more individualistic one, suggesting the whole framework may not generalize evenly across different cultural settings of relationship and selfhood. Taken together, what this research offers is a genuinely different way of understanding why some breakups seem to take so much longer to actually resolve than the objective importance of the relationship, judged from the outside, might predict. The gap between knowing a relationship is over and actually feeling that it is over reflects a real, measurable gap between two different kinds of knowledge, One is the fast, conscious, verbal understanding a person can state clearly within days of a breakup. The other is a slower, more experiential kind of learning, built gradually through repeated encounters with a world that no longer includes the expected presence of a specific partner, a learning process that depends on the brain's attachment, reward, and predictive systems genuinely updating rather than simply being told intellectually that an update is now required. Certain behaviors, continued surveillance, preserved digital archives, repeated contact, appear to interrupt this updating process by continually reintroducing exactly the cues the system is supposed to be learning to live without. Other behaviors and circumstances, reduced contact, new social and romantic connection, and active, organized reflection on what happened appear to support the same underlying process by allowing the brain the space and the repeated disconfirming experience it needs to finally treat the relationship's absence as the new stable reality rather than as an ongoing, unresolved prediction error waiting to be corrected. That is Strides to Solutions for this episode. Thank you for listening.